I'm Dr. Jonathan Clark. I'm a buildings archaeologist and I study both the fabric and the history of historic buildings. My interest here is to conduct that process through. So I'm looking at the fabric and understanding the different phases and how it's developed over time. And I'm also doing historical research to get a better understanding of the context in which those changes took place. Just to set the scene, Calverley Old Hall is sat at the centre of a manor, a big land holding that by the 12th century was owned by the Scott family. We believe that they had a house on a different site before Calverley Old Hall, probably quite close to the parish church. So this is a fresh site that they set up and probably reflects the fact that their name changed from Scott to Calverley, if you like. It's a way of celebrating that established importance in the region. Calverley Old Hall at one level respects the classic arrangement of a medieval house, and that is a service block which contains things like the kitchen, very obviously where the food is prepared, rooms like the buttery and pantry, which is where food and drink is stored and is often in close association with the kitchen. Then you have the principal rooms, the Great Hall, which if you like is the main gathering point for the household. And it's also where guests are received. It's often where feasting takes place, events take place. And on a manorial site like this, it's where tenants might be received. And then you have the more private chambers, the great chambers, the bed chambers, which would have been contained in an area of the building called the solar. And all these components we have at Calverley. The wonder about Calverley, though, is that although that basic framework was established pretty early on, it continues to develop. And the Calverleys, it would seem, being very careful perhaps in their expenditure, were very reluctant to demolish other bits of the building, so they just kept on adding and adding and adding. And part of my job has been to try and disentangle that tangle of buildings that developed around that medieval core. Calverley Old Hall is quite a rambling jumble of structures which sort of encapsulates history from the medieval period right through to the 20th century. So let's go over and take a look. When you look at Calverley Hall from the outside, it does look fairly unprepossessing, and in fact this part of the building looks very much like the 19th century housing that you can see around. But actually, it's concealing something very remarkable. Let's go in and have a look. We've just been looking at the rather unprepossessing 19th century exterior of this building, and it doesn't really prepare you for what you're just about to see. You've got this vast open space. Originally there would have been a first floor in here, but it's been removed. The earliest phase of this building, as far as we can tell, was a solar, timber-framed solar block. Now, the purpose of a solar really is to contain the main important chambers of the household, and these chambers would have been at first floor level in this block. Now, of this early building, we've got all this timber framing surviving. We have posts, rails in the wall, and if we go right up to the top of the wall, we've got something we call a wall plate, which the roof sits on. That's all part of this original work. Now, I think that all dates to the late 13th century. We've got some dendro dating and some radiocarbon dating coming through, which is sort of pointing towards that period. We've got features that relate to the domestic arrangements of that original building. At first floor level, we've got this very fine fireplace, and you can see through its ornamentation that the status of the chamber it would have heated would have been quite high. If we come down to ground floor level, we have this fireplace which has been blocked on a multitude of different occasions, but it's clearly a less fine fireplace and was probably used in part of the service part of the building. In fact, everything on the ground floor would have been just for the servants' use where you would have found rooms like the kitchen, the buttery, the pantry, where food and drink would have been stored. Now this original building would have linked through to a Great Hall on the other side of that building. Now the original Great Hall has gone, but there is still a medieval Great Hall associated with this, a later one that was added on. So that's our main early phase of the building, but of course it didn't stand still, and the Calverleys kept adding to it. So let's go down to the far end of the room and look at some of the early additions that were made on that building. It's when we come down to this end of the building that we can see some of the ways it's been altered. So the original end of the building was reflected in this post you can see in the wall there. Notice it's got a series of slots in there, or mortices, and that's where there would have been returning timbers that would have run across roughly to where I'm stood, and that would have been the end wall. But this fireplace obviously would have broken through that wall, and it's all part of a series of alterations that we think took place in the 1330s. Now this fireplace is probably serving a more elaborate kitchen than the original late 13th century kitchen, so we're still really in the lower status part of the building. Up top, however, you would have had the more plush rooms, and that was elaborated in this period by the carving work that you can see on the trusses. That's the main elements of the roof structure. So it's all becoming much more elaborate as we go through into the 14th century. So we've been looking at really something quite astonishing, sort of hidden underneath this jumble of buildings from the outside. But even on the outside, if you look carefully, you can see clues as to what lurks within. If we look over here, you can see in amongst this jumble of later windows, there's an early window, just a little bit of the window tracery from the head of the window surviving there in amongst that stonework. And that appears to be a medieval window. And then immediately adjacent to it, we have this massive stack. So that's clearly serving something on the inside. So let's have a look and see what we can see on the inside of this building. So if we look at this elevation, we can see further clues to the history of this building. They've got a scatter of these 19th century windows, which perhaps don't tell us too much. But right in the middle here, at ground floor level, we've got a partly blocked in doorway, and then at first floor level, apparently a further doorway, both with the same sort of arch head, what we call a four-centre head, very typical of the 16th or 17th century. Let's go in and take a look. The modest exterior of this building really doesn't prepare you for what you're just about to see. It's absolutely astonishing. Late medieval hammer beam roof. We're now stood in the Great Hall, the more public part of the building. We've been just looking at the solar, which is the inner sanctum, if you like, of the medieval household. Here, this is very much more a public area in the medieval household, and it's that ornamentation that we see in the roof structure. It's all about showing off. That's all complemented by this massive fireplace, which would have heated the Great Hall. Originally, it would have been much longer that way by a further bay with something called a screen's passage, which would have been the main entrance into the hall. So you would have been under no illusions about the importance of the people that owned this place when you walked into it. Now, the date of this hall appears to be the late 15th century. We've had tree ring dating done on the roof timbers to somewhat later than the solar that we've just been talking about. Now, this hall probably replaces an earlier building. Of course, we've seen no sign of that. That's going to be underneath the floor. Now, originally, this room would have been lit by some very fine windows in the long walls. Unfortunately, most of these have been blocked up. We've just got traces of one over there in the corner. Now, this didn't remain a very fine room. we've already looked at the way one end was blocked off with a wall when they were converting that end into a series of private chambers. And in the mid-18th century, the whole room was divided up, a mezzanine floor was inserted, these massive flues stuck right in the middle of the room, and the place was converted into a series of cottages. So if you like, it's fallen from the most highest status to the lowest status use possible. So a building very much demoted in status. But this isn't the only 15th century building we've got at Calverley. We've got another building with another hammer beam roof, and it's the chapel. So let's go and have a look at that next. We're now in the chapel, and here we see an example in miniature of the hammer beam roof that we've been looking at in the Great Hall. This structure, again, we've been able to undertake dendrochronological analysis, tree ring dating, and it seems to be broadly contemporary with the hall, maybe just a little bit later by no more than 3 or 4 years. What we have here is a remarkable surviving example of a domestic chapel, with a gallery where the family would have gathered for services. They would have been watching and looking down where I'm stood, which is where the altar would have been. And we've got some of the liturgical features that you'd associate with a chapel. Here we have a piscina. It's basically a basin for washing holy vessels. And of course the altar lit by a very fine east window. So quite an unusual survivor in this context. So we've looked at the building right up to the end of the medieval period, the late 15th century. Now let's move on to the post-medieval period and see what changes took place then. It's actually worth just stopping before we go and look at the parlour block, just to have a look at this piece of the fabric. We're actually looking at the gable wall of the solar, and at ground floor level we've got a fairly late 17th, 18th century window, nothing too remarkable there. When we go up to first floor level, we've got a window of the late 16th, very early 17th century, which probably goes with some of the changes we've been talking about. If we go above that, actually into the gable proper, and look at either side of the gable, you can see two rectangular patches. On that side, it's mortar, and on the other side is actually a piece of lead. And they're actually covering over timber, because originally the wall plates of the roof structure, the medieval roof structure, projected out. So the roof, rather than stopping flush with the wall face, would have projected out. So it would look very different in the medieval period. In fact, we can see that it was also a much steeper pitch roof. If you look above those little rectangular patches, you can see fossilised in the stonework the steeper pitch of the original roof. Right, let's go and look at the parlour block. We've come round to the modern approach to the building, but it's worth just hesitating here and just having a quick look at the outside. To our right hand side here we've got a 19th century cottage which was added on. To our left we've got a building we'll have a look at in a moment, but has its origins in the late 16th century and is the current landmark. But sandwiched in between them is this thing, which, just looking at the fabric from the outside, has evidently got a bit of a history to it. So I think what we'll do now is take a look inside. We're now very much into the early 16th century here. This is probably a single-storey structure originally, entirely timber framed. We're not sure of its precise function. It might have been a stair tower, or it might have been a bakehouse or brewhouse or something similar, a lower status function. And again, we've been able to date it using tree ring analysis, dendrochronology, and it was constructed in the 1520s. Now the Calverleys, again, seem to change their mind quite rapidly on this, and sometime in the 1540s, again we've been able to date it using tree ring dating, they inserted this full structure above me, and you can see it's got these really finely moulded beams and suggests a higher status use for this space. And in fact on the ground floor we do have this very fine fireplace and a suggestion of maybe the domestic arrangements. This little room might have served to house a lavatory. And we also have a direct physical connection with the rest of the household, now blocked up, but a doorway here. In fact, this doorway, which we looked at in the solar, suggests there might have been an earlier structure in this location predating this thing from the 1520s. We get a greater sense of the status of this building if we now go upstairs and look at something on the walls. At a glance, not a great deal to see up here, all modern decoration and a 1940s fireplace. But there's a few bits of timber work that perhaps you can see just poking through the wall. Let's have a look over here. This is a jowl post. It's part of the original 1520s structure. But look very carefully at the structure. Can you make out there's a figure in there? Look at the black and the green work there and surviving down that post. So this is quite an elaborately decorated space. And we know it's throughout because wherever the plasterwork falls away, you see a little bit more decoration. There's a little bit more right up in that corner. So originally, quite an elaborate and finely decorated room. Most of this decoration seems to date to the latter part of the 16th century. We walk into this room, we walk into this part of the hall, and we're in the second half of the 16th century. Now this is the current landmark, but this part of the building actually became the principal part of Calverley Hall in the latter part of the 16th century. So rather than going in through the medieval Great Hall, a visitor would have come in through the doorway that I've just walked through. They would have entered this room, which was probably the hall. There would have been a more private inner chamber running off at that end, actually incorporated into the solar. And over on the other side of the house, we would have had the service rooms, the kitchen and such like. Now we've got some idea of the status of this room just by simply looking at this very fine moulded fireplace surround, a bit bashed around. And we also know the date because we've been able to do our dendrochronology or tree ring dating on these timbers, and they come out right towards the end of the 16th century. So we can pin the date of this structure down pretty firmly. Above us we would have had, first floor level, a great chamber. This is a dual function room effectively. It's both a bedroom and also a reception room and other private chambers. So the hall is being reconfigured at this stage, and this is something we then see for the next 100 years. And we'll go to a different part of the building to see how the impact of those changes were made. Just before we leave the landmark, or this part of the hall at Calverley, just have a look above the doorway here. And we've got these two fellas. They actually came out of one of the cottages that was demolished when the place was made into a landmark, from a cottage that was built in the 18th century. Now these two figures probably sat either side of a fireplace, and these apertures, their mouths, were so designed to allow smoke to come out. Not particularly politically correct these days. We've been round this building both physically and chronologically, and I think we've got a pretty good idea. It's quite a rambling jumble of structures. There's this one last part of the building I wouldn't mind taking a look in, which sort of encapsulates that full history from the medieval period right through to the 20th century. So let's go over and take a look. As we've been seeing, Calverley Hall is a place that has been subject to constant change, constant addition and constant alteration. This part of the building actually encapsulates all of that, all those different periods. I've just walked through a doorway, which is modern, apparently, but when you look above, you actually see a medieval archway. And the reason we have a medieval archway here is that we're actually stood in the screens passage of the Great Hall. Earlier on, we looked at the main body of the Great Hall, and I said one end had been divided off. Well, this is the bit that had been divided off, but was the original main entrance to the medieval house. Now, we can see later changes. Where the plaster has been removed over here, we actually have a blocked up, massive fireplace that extends all the way to the other side of the wall. And this reflects the way the building was used probably in the later part of the 17th century, when this part was divided off from the Great Hall. So we need to look upstairs, I think, to see more evidence of the medieval origin of this part of the building. When you come up to the first floor in this part of the hall, you're in for a big shock because you've got these massive timbers apparently running through a fairly modern bedroom. Now these timbers are really important. We are actually within the Great Hall, which has been subdivided off from the main bulk of it. But these timbers allow us to understand how that hall worked. And the reason is that they are different to the hammer beam trusses that we saw through the rest of the hall and indeed in the chapel. These are of a different form and they're called spear trusses. And spear trusses are always used at the low end of the hall. And it just demarks what is the high status end and what is the low status end and the entrance end of the hall. And that's further emphasised here by the fact that this side is quite plain. But if we come round to the other side, and we can see it's all been moulded with additional decoration. And that's because this is the public side of the timber. It's facing into the Great Hall. It's what you would have seen when you came into this original great space. Of course, you can't see it today because it was all blocked off in the late 17th century. We've just been through this incredible labyrinth of spaces, buildings that constitutes Calverley Hall. Now that is a reflection of the way the building was divided up in the 18th century and later. But originally, of course, it was one great house, one single dwelling. And a significant part of the landmark project here is to try and get us back to that original great medieval house.